Israel claims that it has the right to use armed force in the Gaza Strip, but Israel does not believe that the Gaza Strip is occupied territory. So attributing to Israel the legal position that there is a right to self-defense from occupied territory would be, from the Israeli perspective, slightly inaccurate. But the point is, the legal question is whether under international law, a state can claim the right to self-defense under the UN Charter, Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, for attacks that originate from occupied territory.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Ayesha Malik. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the law of occupation. Now, an occupation is defined under international law in Article 42 of the Hague Regulations from 1907, which state that territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. And the occupation extends only to the territory where such authority has been established and can be exercised. Now, the law of occupation seeks to balance three often conflicting and competing interests: that of the ousted sovereign, the occupying power, and the occupied population. And this is seen in almost every provision of the law which applies to this unique situation. So, for instance, Article 43 says that the occupying power is to take all the measures in his power to restore and ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety, while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force in the country. This emphasizes the temporary nature of an occupation, in that as sovereign title has not been passed on to the occupying power, it cannot take action which would be the prerogative of a sovereign state. So it must just restore and ensure public order and safety and can't amend the laws in force in the country. The occupying power holds the territory in trust for the ousted sovereign, and it is therefore hostile to the notion that the occupying power can alter the legal status of the territory beyond that which is required. This has proved contentious, however, particularly in the case of transformative occupations. So occupiers have received censure for changing the laws in occupied territory beyond that which is allowed under the law of occupation. The United States was criticized during its occupation of Iraq in 2003 for violating the regime, as they went as far as to establish a new Iraqi constitution. One of the key issues with the law of occupation is the fact that it envisaged short-term occupations in which the sovereignty of the occupying power needed to be temporary and the ousted sovereign's interests had to be maintained. However, we now have instances of long-standing and protracted occupations which have lasted for many decades. These include those in Palestine, Western Sahara, and Northern Cyprus. To talk to us about this and more, we have with us Marco Longobardo. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, everyone. We are very happy to be joined by Marco Longobardo, who is reader in international law at the School of Law of the University of Westminster and has written a book on the use of armed force in occupied territory, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start off by asking you, how is an occupation defined under international law, and what are the obligations imposed on the occupying power?
The legal definition of occupied territory is embodied in Article 42 of the 1907 Hague Regulation, quite old treaty that is still in force today. According to this definition, a territory is considered occupied when it is actually placed under the authority of the hostile army. This definition can be unpacked by considering that the law occupation applies to a territory that is controlled effectively by an enemy army, an army that is exercising a hostile control over the territory without the consent of the sovereign or the local population of that territory. This definition corresponds to customary international law, and once a territory fulfills this definition, once a territory is under occupation, international humanitarian law places the state that occupies that territory, that we call occupying power, under a certain number of obligations. These obligations can be mainly divided into groups. We have obligations that protect the local population. and they are codified both in the 1907 Hague Regulations and the 1949 Fourth Geneva Convention. And then we have some rules, some obligations protecting the ousted sovereign. The basic idea is that under international law, an occupation is a temporary situation, at the end of which the territory under occupation goes back under the control of the ousted sovereign. So occupation must be temporary, should not alter the territory in an indefinite way, and the life under occupation should continue as much as possible as it was before the occupation. In fact, the Hague Regulations creates a duty for the occupying power under Article 43 to administer the occupied territory, preserving and maintaining a public order and civil life. The idea is under occupation people die, people get married, people divorce, and even if occupations can happen during an armed conflict, the life of the local population should be as little disrupted as possible, and at the end of the occupation, the territory should return to the ousted sovereign.
So given the notion that an occupation was envisaged to be something which was temporary, and it was largely shaped by World War II and earlier conflicts, do you think that it still fits the realities of 21st century conflicts, particularly when we're looking at cases of prolonged occupations? I mean, Israel has been in occupation of Palestine since 1967.
The question is tricky in the sense that we do not have an expiry date for an occupation. The occupation says it must be temporary. That means it should not be an open-ended occupation, but it never says the occupation that should be short-lived. Now, clearly, we know that the drafters of the relevant treaties had in mind situations of occupation that would have lasted months, maybe a couple of years, nothing more than that. But there is no time limit in international humanitarian law. The need to bring to an end an occupation can be constructed correctly under other rules of international law, like the ban on the use of force, like the principle of self-determination of peoples. But under IHL, international humanitarian law, the law on conflict, there is no expiring date. With this in mind, your question is interesting because if we think that a state occupies a territory just as a matter of necessity during an armed conflict, with the idea of returning that territory to the ousted sovereign at the end of the conflict, the occupation would perfectly be fit for this kind of situations. The problems with so-called prolonged occupations today, like Northern Cyprus, like Western Sahara, like Palestine, is that the occupying powers pretend to administer the occupied territory only temporarily, but they do not have any serious intention to return these territories to the ousted sovereign. Morocco doesn't consent to the establishment of a Sahrawi state in Western Sahara. Israel is very clearly against the creation of a Palestinian state or the recognition of a Palestinian state in Palestine. And so it's not a problem of the law. It's the fact is that the occupations are not conducted, not established today with the aims and the goals that were in the mind of the drafters of the relevant treaties. So I think that if we talk about short-lived occupation today, it's like you might remember that a couple of, I think last year, Ukraine managed to occupy a small area of Russian territory. The occupation is super fit for purpose in those kind of situations. Protects the ousted sovereign, protects the local population, does not alter permanently the legal regime of that territory, the legal status of that territory. The problem is when states in bad faith occupy territories with the idea not to return them. At that point, the occupation might not be the most fit for purpose legal regime on the one hand, but on the other, it's the only available legal regime. The alternative would be considering occupied territory as lawfully annexed by the occupying power, like Israel claims is the case of East Jerusalem, or like Russia claims is the case for Crimea. And this would run against all the main principles of international law on the ban of use of force, on the need not to recognize territorial acquisition as a result of the use of force. So at the end of the day, the law occupation, in my opinion, is a tool that could be improved or that could be used better. But for certain situations, it's the only tool that we can apply, at least to govern the daily life of the population in the occupied territory. So today there is a huge emphasis on the idea that certain occupations are entirely illegal. And I think this is correct from the standpoint of different rules of international law, like the ban on conquest and the principle of self-determination of peoples. But the illegality of the occupation should not be used as an argument not to apply the occupation, but just the two sets of rules should be applied, in my opinion, in parallel. One set of rules to try to protect the local population and the ousted sovereign during the occupation, and other rules focusing on the illegality of the occupation to try to force the occupying power to leave the territory, to withdraw from the territory and put the occupation to an end.
And it's interesting, I think, that we can go straight from that into a question about the right to self-determination and how that works in tandem and how we should think about the relationship between the two. Because particularly when it comes to prolonged occupations, then surely the right to self-determination is just more and more frustrated the longer the occupation goes on.
You are perfectly right. This is unfortunately the product of general aspect of international lawmaking. In international law, there is no centralized lawmaking authority. We don't have a parliament passing a legislation for all the states. So very often, international law rules develop in a chaotic, sometimes conflicting way. Now, the law occupation is older than the principle of self-determination of peoples. If we want to trace its roots, we can say that it is with the end of the Napoleonic era, when states decided to return to the hosted sovereigns all the European portions of territory that Napoleon had conquered. The principle of self-determination of peoples as a legal rule, not as a philosophical rule, was born, I would say, with World War II. Basically, largely between World War I and World War II, it entered the positive law at the end of World War II. So clearly, it is far more recent than the law occupation. The law occupation is about preserving the status quo, the situation as it is. The principle of self-determination of people is about disrupting unlawful situations that are seen as oppression of certain peoples. Now, how we can reconcile the two sets of rules in contemporary international law? For sure, considering that in certain fields, such as the protection of natural resources, the law occupation and the principle of self-determination of people reinforce each other. They tend, both sets of rules tend to protect natural resources and the titularity, the ownership of those resources for the local population of the occupied territory. Clearly, there is an argument that today most, if not all, occupations should be considered to be unlawful because of a conflict with the principle of self-determination of peoples. The local population under occupation, if as its self-determination limited by the presence of the occupying power. And in fact, this tension is very clear in relation to different situations of occupation around the world that have reached recently international courts. The International Court of Justice in 2024 declared that the prolonged occupation of Palestine by Israel is unlawful because it conflicts with the principle of self-determination of peoples. The court did not say that all occupations are unlawful. However, this conclusion was reached, if I recall correctly, in 2023 by the African Court on Peoples and Human Rights, that in a decision on Western Sahara that is under Moroccan occupation, the decision was a technical decision that was dismissed for procedural issues. But the court noted in passing that all occupations today are unlawful because all occupations today violate the principle of self-determination of peoples. So for sure, we have to recognize that the two sets of rules can be constructed sometimes in a conflicting way. The principle of self-determination of peoples is a peremptory norm of international law under occupation, according to International Court of Justice, and at least it should be used to determine the illegality of the occupation in its entirety. An occupation can be entirely unlawful if it conflicts with the principle of self-determination of peoples. On the other hand, while that unlawful illegal occupation is in place, the rules on the law occupation codified by international maritime law conventions should apply to protect the local population.
And talking about the occupation, which is in the news the most and has been over the last 2 years, I wanted to ask you what you think about Israel's claim that it has the right to self-defense in occupied territory.
The question is tricky, and I beg your forgiveness if I rephrase it. Israel claims that it has the right to use armed force in the Gaza Strip, but Israel does not believe that the Gaza Strip is occupied territory. So attributing to Israel the legal position that there is a right to use self-defense from occupied territory would be, from the Israeli perspective, slightly inaccurate. But the point is, the legal question is whether under international law, a state can claim the right to self-defense under the UN Charter, Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, for attacks that originate from occupied territory. Now, this legal question was discussed by the International Court of Justice in 2004 in relation to Israel and Palestine, but before the most recent and horrible escalation. And the court claimed that a state cannot invoke self-defense under Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations from attacks originating from a territory that is under occupation. The conclusion is, in my opinion, correct, but we should emphasize that the court said that it's not self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter that applies. But the court emphasized that an occupying power has the possibility to, and the duty even, to protect its own citizens from attacks originating from the occupied territory. So there is a possibility for Israel to protect its own citizens in relation to attacks such as the 7 October one. It's different the source. It's not the source Article 51, the UN Charter, but the source is the very law occupation that, as we said at the beginning, allows and even demands the occupying power to maintain public order. In the notion of maintaining public order, there is the idea of protecting even the citizens of the occupied or the occupying power. The situation is even more complex if we consider that the presence of the occupying power in the case of Israel is unlawful as declared by the International Court of Justice. There is an argument that in a case of unlawful occupation, the claim of self-defense is even less tenable than in cases of lawful occupations. But the problem is complex. It is a matter of situating which is the specific rule that authorizes to what extent it authorizes the occupying power to protect its citizens. It's not Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations. It is the limited, the rule that is quite limited in its scope of the law occupation that demands the occupying power to maintain public order and civil life in the occupied territory.
And in terms of Israel's argument that it has not been occupying Gaza, it does argue that it disengaged from the territory in 2005, and so it's no longer an occupying power. In light of what the ICJ said in its advisory opinion in 2024, and even the fact that that hasn't really trickled into other countries, including Pakistan, which have discussed Israel reoccupying Gaza in light of its current military operation, what do you make of those arguments?
I think that here there is quite a certain confusion between the legal notion of occupation and the notion of occupation that is used in popular discourse, in the media. Under international law, a situation occupation as defined under Article 42 of the Hague Regulations does not require the presence of foreign troops in every square meter of the occupied territory. In other words, the physical presence of Israeli troops in the Gaza Strip is not required to establish, to maintain Israeli occupation over the Gaza Strip. Now, it's true that in 2005, Israel withdrew its soldiers from the Gaza Strip. But Israel maintained the control of the borders, the control of the maritime territory, the control of the airspace of the Gaza Strip, the control of vital supplies, the control over who and what enters the Gaza Strip. The control is total. For years, Israeli scholars tried to argue that there is a small border with Egypt, the Rafah crossing, and so there is no total control by Israel. This is wrong because we've seen in these months when Egypt tried to open the Rafah crossing against the will of Israel, Israel bombed the crossing and Egypt was prevented from doing so. So from a legal standpoint, the authority, the control exercised by Israel from outside the Gaza Strip, coupled with the fact that the Gaza Strip is a very small geographic area, it still is highly densely populated, make it irrelevant the fact that Israeli troops were not, before the 7th October 2023, physically present in the Gaza Strip. The occupation lasted because the control of Israel lasted from outside the borders of the Strip. This point that was at the center of a significant debate for 2 decades is completely moot after 7 October 2023 because Israel is deploying its soldiers in the Gaza Strip now. It's building roads, it's building barracks for the soldiers, it's taking control of infrastructure. So I think that the correct position would be that the Gaza Strip has always been under Israeli occupation since 1967. But even an attempt to give credit to the idea that Israel relinquished control and abandoned the occupation of the Gaza Strip in 2005, that in my opinion is incorrect, anyway, does not stand the present situation after October 2023, in which Israel physically re-entered the Strip. So in my opinion, the law occupation fully applies, has fully applied to the Gaza Strip since 1967. If I can add one word to this, there is clearly an obvious objection that is represented by Hamas administration in the Gaza Strip that has been very effective for from almost 2 decades. When we talk about occupation in legal terms, we should pay attention to the fact that the occupation does not displace a local administration. It is true that the ultimate administrator is the occupying power. But according to the law occupation, the local population should self-administer itself. We mentioned it in passing before. The normal life in the occupied territory should go on as little altered as possible during the occupation. There are specific rules of the relevant treaties that say that public officials, that judicially, that institutions for the education, institutions for healthcare should continue under the occupation. A good occupation that complies with international humanitarian law, is an occupation that is almost entirely run by the local population, with the occupying power intervening only when strictly necessary to restore and ensure public order and civil life. This means, in relation to Gaza, that the fact that Israel allowed Hamas to administer the Gaza Strip in itself is not a winning point to conclude that the Strip was not under occupation. It is an element to be taken into account, but it's not decisive.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for answering these questions.
A pleasure. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Legally Speaking. We hope you'll join us for future episodes on the laws of war.
Powered by International Committee of the Red Cross.